All right. So welcome everyone, all of our listeners. This is Dewitt Scott, and I am one half of the podcast. One half of this conversation. One half of this conversation.
We're not quite at a podcast yet. We'll get
Not
there.
quite at a podcast yet. The whole world is doing podcasts, so it's at the front of my brain. But one half of Dewitt and Hannah's conversation connected to Moraine reads and our love of books and book analysis, discussion, breakdown, everything. So hello, thank you for tuning in, and I'll let Hannah introduce herself.
Yeah, hey, so I'm Hannah Carlton, librarian at Moraine Valley. And so for this conversation for the Moraine Reads Project, we've decided to talk about some books relating to Chicago, because it's something that we have in common and I think is important to people in the Moraine community who might be listening to this, and also beyond. Lots of people could potentially be interested in these awesome books about Chicago that we're going to share with you. So, so we're each going to share a couple of books, and we've arranged them kind of chronologically in terms of how they come into like the history of Chicago as it goes through time. So I'm going to start. My first book is called Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin. So this book came to me actually when I was doing my undergraduate work at the University of Iowa. I took this awesome history class about the natural history of Chicago and Prussia in the second half of the 20th century. And this was one of the books that we used in that class. And I just remember that it blew my mind in terms of, it just totally like flipped things I thought I knew about Chicago, because I grew up in Evanston, which is like the first suburb north of Chicago. So it's like, I thought I knew Chicago, sort of like how it had been founded, what that looked like. But reading this book, I kind of realized that I didn't really know at all what that had looked like. And a big part of that is like a big part of Cronin's thesis is that like humans and the environment are like these two forces that act on each other to create environments. I have this great quote that I wanted to read that kind of summarized it really nicely. Here we go. Okay. So we fail to see that our own flight from the city, in quotes, creates the wild, in quotes, as its symbolic opposite, and pulls that seemingly most natural of places into our own cultural orbit. We alter it with our presence, and even with the ways we think about it. Just as our own lives continue to be embedded in a web of natural relationships, nothing in nature remains untouched by the web of human relationships that constitute our common history. And in that fact lies the measure of our moral responsibility for each other and for the world, whether urban or rural, human or natural, we are in this together. So Cronin is making this argument that the humans who, built Chicago and settled this area were influenced by the natural environment, and in turn, they have shaped the natural environment. So it's this very like, we create our own environment, and our environment also kind of creates us, which I think is kind of cool. But some of the other like things about the book that just really kind of struck me that, Chicago, I think when like teachers teach about the history of Chicago, they talk about it as this like confluence of like natural resources. And I always thought about that, like, you have rivers, you have lakes, the railroad came here, but there's also, we're at this like confluence of environments too. Like we have the grain, the kind of the Great Corn Belt grain area, where, all the grain kind of came to Chicago as a great transportation point. We have all of the lumber like up north in Wisconsin that came south through Chicago. And then we have the stockyards, right? Where like tons and tons of natural resources kind of come together in this confluence of Chicago. And that's one way in which kind of the natural environment shaped the rise of Chicago as a city. So it's a little bit of it's a thick book, and it's not like, I don't know, it's not like something that you can read quickly, but it's definitely, it shifted the way that I think about Chicago as a city. It didn't just rise organically. It was something that was shaped.
I think what makes that so important is that, as time passes and the older the city becomes, we get so disconnected from the initial history. So it's almost impossible now to think about Chicago outside of concrete buildings, brick, metro. So to think about it in the way or the way that Nature's Metropolis breaks it down as an adaptation of the original environment, and then this, like you said, this confluence of the stockyards, about the lumber from the north, from Wisconsin, like that is so. It's just so foreign to 2021 Michigan Avenue, Mag Mile, just this, and I think that's really what makes that book so important, because it's a timeless text about a city and the start of the city that everyone has to know. If not, then you just get so disconnected from what, from the beginning. So
yeah. I think about it like, if you go, you drive, I don't know, 2 hours outside Chicago and you start seeing cornfields, right? But I never thought like about how this is like so connected and intertwined, and how without the cornfields we wouldn't be here, and maybe vice versa. I don't know. It's like they're stuck together. Yeah. So this is a good primer on kind of how like the city of Chicago came into being. I guess one thing I think to say that Cronin doesn't talk a lot about is like, the people who were here before the white settlers came and started doing all of this, started changing the land and creating the city. I guess that's something I would say about a limitation of this book, that's important to mention. But otherwise, it's a great, it chronicles that like important aspect of the environmental history of Chicago.
So what year, if you can remember, what year was it when you started to read the Nature's Metropolis?
Oh gosh, I think it was maybe 2013, 2014, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's been a while.
Okay.
Not too long.
You're young, so it feels like a while to you, but it's not. It's not. You're early 20s, so it's like 2014 was a while ago, but so 2014, and I'm thinking about that time period, and I can't really think of a specific Chicago moment, but I'm trying to see where your everyday life was at 2014, and how you experienced the city versus picking up that book at that time and it sort of teleporting you back to the start.
Yeah, well, so one thing is that I wasn't in Chicago when I read it. I was in Iowa, in the middle of all of the corn.
Yes, it's like prime corn. That's the prime corn area, right?
I should say, there's more to Iowa than that, but
Are you sure?
Well, I should have some school pride and say, no, but I'll be the the Chicago born and bred person, or the
okay.
and say, okay, well, we'll just call Iowa the corn place, and hope no one objects. But it's also that I guess that I was an undergraduate student, and it was kind of it's that time in your life, I feel like, when you're starting to think about the places that and the people and the things that you thought you understood, and you learn things and you see different perspectives and things kind of turn. So I feel like it was a part of that process as an undergraduate student in the humanities that I went through, like so many others, where I realized I didn't know everything, and a lot of what I thought I knew wasn't right.
Right. Re-education.
Yeah. Or opening more doors and seeing more perspectives than what I grew up with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like a really great book. And again, I mean, nobody really talks about Chicago from that standpoint. Um, you know, never really going back that far.
Well, and so this is getting off track, but but
It's
I
never
feel like
off track.
we can get off track. But so, the flip side of this in the class I took, comparing it to Prussia in the late half of the 19th century, like they were going through almost exactly the same thing. Like they cleared, or they drained hundreds of miles of marshes to create farmland.
Okay.
And it was this development, this human impetus of development on the land, that led the way to kind of the the rise of Russia and the unification of Germany later. So it was a really interesting, to look at these two side by side, and think about how the similar processes were happening in different places and how they led countries kind of in different directions, or how, yeah.
Okay. Another interesting part is the connection to Prussia, right?
Well, yeah, and I feel like this is something that has happened in a lot of places in the world, and I guess we don't talk about it as much, or like the idea of environmental history, of how humans have affected the environment and vice versa, is something, I don't know, it feels like it's like a niche bit of history that it's cool to talk about more.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's important. I mean, it shows that, I mean, for lack of the popular text, but the world is flat, right? Obviously, I know the world is round, but it's flat in the sense that it's so much that connects us. It's much more that connects us across continents than it is that really divides us.
Yeah, kind of the relationship, the human relationship with nature is a constant
everywhere you go.
Yeah.
No matter what language you speak.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. That human connection to nature, no matter the culture, no matter, it's always central, or I don't want to say central, but it's foundational.
Yeah. That's cool. I hadn't thought about it that way before.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a wonderful book. When was it published? I'm just wondering.
It's not a new book. It was published in the 90s. But it's like, it's come to it, it's very well regarded. The librarian in me, I went out and I looked at book reviews of it in preparing for this, and so there are
so perfect.
It's a very librarian thing to do. You don't have to, you can come to your own opinion about a book, but you can also like aggregate other people's opinions. But there was like a Publishers Weekly review of it that was pretty glowing, and then there are some in history journals that are also pretty so it's a pretty well regarded book, not just by me.
Yeah. But I thank you for bringing it to my attention. I had no knowledge of the book before now, but definitely now something that I will have to take a look into.
Well, Moraine Library actually has a copy if you want to borrow it. So
even better, right?
There we go. Yeah.
Easy to access.
Oh, we try. Well, what about your first book, Dewitt?
So my first book, actually, not discussing Chicago, but not necessarily as far back as Nation's Metropolis. My first book is actually a book called The Defender. And The Defender is, for most people who live in the area, it is about the Black-owned newspaper, the Chicago Defender. And Chicago Defender is one of the longest-running Black-owned newspapers in the nation, one of the more prominent in the nation. It doesn't produce hard copy newspapers anymore, as 2021 is just a digital world now. So many newspapers are either fading or already have faded. So the Defender a few years ago stopped making hard copy, but the website is still up. But the book, it is titled and talks about the Defender, but everything in the book, and just like everything with the newspaper, is centered around Black life in Chicago. So it takes you from the start of the Defender, which was started in 1905 by Robert Abbott, who was a Black man from Georgia, born and raised in Georgia. He moved to Chicago and he started the newspaper. And the idea was to use the Defender. He was activist minded. It was like a tool of resistance in a sense, that he would write about things going on in the Black community, particularly positive things in the North. And then he would highlight some of the tragedies that were taking place in the South, with the idea of making these stories national to give more people an understanding of what Black people were experiencing in negative terms in the South and what they could do differently in the North. And 1905 is before the Great Migration. He came up before the Great Migration, but the newspaper has been credited with playing a large part in pushing the Great Migration of Black people from the South to the North. For those that were living in the South, this is early 1900s, 1920s in that area. Obviously, slavery was over, but Jim Crow laws were the norm. Sharecropping was the normal occupation. And many people in the South dealing with sharecropping, which is low pay, dealing with Jim Crow laws, which are dehumanizing, and then dealing with just random acts of violence from racist organizations, White Citizens Council, KKK. They were looking for somewhere to go that was different, where they could have more opportunity. The North always looked that way. The Defender, the newspaper, would publish these stories and encourage Black people from the South to come to the North. And the newspaper itself would be seen as contraband in a lot of Southern places, right? Authorities, police, and everything would see people with the Defender. They would take the Defender. They saw the Defender laying around. They would take it. Some people were harassed for reading the Defender, and Black people felt empowered when they would read the Defender. And many of them made the decision to come North based off of the stories that they read. And that's where you start to get the influx, not just North, but the influx to Chicago, right? And Chicago, it's changed, and as we talk about these books, we sort of point that out. It's changed a lot racially, going from an all-white city to, a city in recent times that was majority Black, or at least Black people were a large percentage of the people. Sort of starting with the Great Migration, moving north. Now, many of them were caught off guard with how cold it was, right? You moving from Mississippi and Alabama, and you get off the train in January in Chicago. This is not, no one can prepare you for that. But when they got here, they saw it as an opportunity, right? And it's an opportunity for them to avoid violence, to get better jobs, to have better schools for their children, and start a new life. So the book centers Black life in an explanation of how the paper began. And it covers the paper from the beginning all the way up into the rise and the presidential term of Barack Obama, as a way to sort of juxtapose where the Defender started and where the city is, in 2016. I think it was published in 2017. So that's where it 2016, that's where it sort of ends.
That's fascinating. So I'd of course I've heard about the Defender and I knew about its role in Chicago, but I had no idea that it had such a national audience, or that its range was so wide. That's fascinating to me.
Yes, it had a very prominent audience all across the country among Black people, and again, it was just empowering. There's even stories in the book about Black adults in the South who could not read. Right, they would get the Defender and they would find someone to read it to them. Right, and sometimes they would do this in groups. It was like the first study groups, or I don't want to say the first, but study groups where they would have someone actually read these stories and make them think differently. Like, hey, maybe we could live a different way and we can go north and not just Chicago, but move to Detroit, move to New York, move to Milwaukee, move above the Mason-Dixon line. And with moving particularly to Chicago, right? As we talk about the history of Chicago, when these Black people did move to Chicago, many of them, almost all of them, would live in the area that we now know as Bronzeville, right? Which is unofficially between 31st Street and 51st Street. And then it runs east to the lake, all the way west till about State Street. That's where the majority of Black people were confined, again, off of racial segregation, restrictive covenants. They couldn't really go further than that without encountering violence. That was another surprise, that they realized that there was violence up here too, racial violence. But that confinement in Bronzeville forced them to depend on one another, build businesses that serviced each other because they couldn't really get services outside of the neighborhood, protecting and control their own area. And what most people don't really recognize is that Bronzeville at that time, well, I want to say the early 1900s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, it really rivaled Harlem with it as being the center of Black life. Now, Harlem is always famed and is historical for its predominantly Black history, obviously the Harlem Renaissance and everything that came with that. But Bronzeville doesn't get as much attention, but did the exact same thing. Some say even better, right? And it actually, the cultural renaissance of Bronzeville actually came right as the Harlem Renaissance was dying down. Funny story, kind of off topic, but if anyone that follows or knows anything about basketball, you have the Harlem Globetrotters, which is the entertainment team. They have the red, white, and blue ball, and they play the music. They do tricks, right? They're not an actual team. They do tricks. They entertain, right? They're called the Harlem Globetrotters. They were started in Bronzeville, Chicago, right? That's where the team was started, right? At Phillips High School, right on 39th Street in Bronzeville, with the understanding that when the team was started, the owner, Saperstein is his name. The owner, he got these guys together. He felt they would be entertaining. He wanted to take them on the road to make money to do these tricks, and they needed a name. So they said, we're going to trot the globe. We'll be Globetrotters. We'll be the Chicago Globetrotters. But the owner said, well, nobody would ever believe that Chicago has this many Black people. So we can't call ourselves the Chicago Globetrotters. It's not real. Nobody's going to buy into that, right? And we think about Chicago in 2021, it's so Black, right? But in 1920, in the 1920s, they couldn't sell the team as the Chicago Globetrotters. So at the time, Harlem was the default area. So Harlem Globetrotters. Those guys had never come from Harlem. They knew nothing about Harlem.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, it's a snapshot to just show what Bronzeville was to Chicago, and still is, and has become to Chicago. The book explains that very, very authentically in great detail.
Yeah. I knew, like, you always hear about Gwendolyn Brooks and all of the musicians who came out of Bronzeville and kind of the rich cultural tradition there. I'd never thought of it kind of as parallel to the, kind of the well-recognized Harlem Renaissance. I don't know, in some ways this feels like another way that Chicago gets like that second city chip. And I'm just like, come on, guys, come on.
Yes. Particularly when you think about the Harlem Globetrotter story.
Like that.
That definitely has a second city, little brother, little sister feeling. All right.
Okay. I'm not much of a basketball person, but I grew up in the 90s. So I tend to think of Chicago as a basketball kind of city, right? Yeah. It's like,
yeah, like central to basketball. And you think about that time and it's like, no, the owner was like, we can't sell it. It's just, nobody's going to believe all these Black people. You have 10 Black guys in Chicago? Like, no. It's like, it has to be Harlem. It's so ironic for today.
Oh dear. So did you have a second book you wanted to talk about here too?
Yes, Connected to the Defender is another great book called An Autobiography of Black Chicago, right? Written by Dempsey Travis, who was a really great man in his own right. He was an author, he's an activist, he was a real estate mogul, but he writes a book that's similar. It parallels a lot The Defender. It was written way earlier. I want to say in the late 80s. But he talks about, 1981. But he talks about the Great Migration, the move of Black people up north, and then he talks heavily about all of the accomplishments and the successful Black people in Chicago who started in Chicago and had an impact on the world, right? And when you're talking entertainment, obviously this is before our time, right? We not around, but someone like a Mr. T from the A-Team right? Mr. T, you have Red Fox, who played Fred Sanford. You have Don Cornelius, right? All three of them went to the same high school, right?
Really?
Don Cornelius was the host of Soul Train for so many years, right? So Red Fox, Fred Sanford, the comedian. You had Dinah Washington, who's a singer. You had Sarah Vaughan, who was a singer. And of course, I'm going to forget some people. So, you had Lou Rawls, who was a singer. It was Chicago Southside just produced so much talent that a lot of people just didn't recognize or just didn't know Shaka Khan. Whatever. I mean, just, and this book details that, right? It details that with great detail, great stories being told, supporting evidence, pictures of people, a really great book that is most people just don't even know about, right? It just don't know about. And I read the book in college and undergrad long before I think you were like in grade school when I was an undergrad, but I read it in undergrad. Much like you read Nature's Metropolis where you were in undergrad in Iowa. So, and I asked you, well, how did it feel being in the city when you read the book? And you was like, I wasn't in the city. All right. I read Autobiography of Chicago, Black Chicago, while I was in undergrad in Indiana. Right. So I wasn't in the city and I was reading about it. Like I grew up in that city and there was so much that I just didn't know. And, like you said, you think you can know something, being a Chicago kid, being from the city, and then you read a book and it's like, I didn't know any of that. This is the greatest thing about books, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think like we're getting at this, like, comparatively, like Chicago isn't that old, right? It's like, I don't know. I think it's barely 200 years old, maybe not even.
Right.
But it does have this deep history, and it's because just like so many people have lived here and have gone on to do things in the larger world.
Yeah, just really expanded beyond the city, but always been tied to their roots, never necessarily forgotten where they're from. But you're right, 200 years is very young for a city.
Yeah, even for like an American city. I mean, you think about like New York, and I think they can lay claim to like 400 years, maybe.
Yeah, and that's exceptional.
Like, yeah.
So, yeah, that's
Chicago as the younger sibling, but just as influential.
yeah, and the story should be told, which is great that we having a conversation like this, because yes, we've been the little brother, little sister city, but when the New York is the media capital of the world, you can tell your own narratives over and over and over, right?
Yeah, and so it takes something like a voice like the Defender, right, emerging as a new voice, telling a different story, and it resonated not only with audiences in Chicago, but like you said, across the South. It's a different niche. It's coming up from like, I don't know, it's like coming up from like the underdog. Like there's a power there, right? That where you don't have to like fight against established traditions, or I don't know.
Yeah. And these books, Nation's Metropolis, The Defender, Black Chicago, it essentially is indirectly pointing to the fact of there's so much to be prideful about that we don't even need the comparisons, right? We don't even need the comparisons. It's so much here, right? And I love New York. I've been a lot of times, but I mean, this city, Chicago's on the lake. Like you can't beat that. Like, 5 boroughs, those 5 boroughs, but Chicago is, it's better. That's just my opinion.
I heartily agree.
Yeah. So. Yeah.
I have a hard time imagining living too far away or too many other places, I guess.
Yeah. But so with the breakdown of these books, The Defender, Autobiography of Black Chicago, and the heavy insistence on Bronzeville, I think it's a great connection to your next book.
Yeah. So, I wanted to recommend Eve Ewing's Ghosts in the Schoolyard.
Another Chicago native.
Yes. So just a little like context for this book. So Eve Ewing is a sociologist. I think she's a sociologist, and she's a teacher. She kind of came up as a middle school teacher in Chicago public schools, and then went and got her PhD and is kind of studies education as a sociologist now. She's also just kind of a shout out. She wrote the Moraine One Book, One College selection this year, the poetry collection 1919. So she is a scholar. Yes, it's wonderful. She's a scholar. She's an artist. She's kind of like a Twitter master. If you follow her on Twitter, she's great.
A poet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so Eve Ewing kind of took as her, I think this is what she wrote her dissertation on, and then she kind of turned it into this book too. But she looked at school closings in Chicago, in the Chicago public school system. And so specifically, she looked at one high school in Bronzeville, Dewitt High School, that was slated to be closed a little bit before the kind of the mass the mess of mass school closings that came up around 2013. I think Dewitt was slated to be like closed in 2011, and there was a process. There was a whole, there's a huge neighborhood movement, community movement to stop it, and they actually ended up succeeding, I believe. So it's still open in a slightly different capacity, but it's back on now, which is great. But then, so she looks at the kind of the community movement around the Dewitt closing specifically. Then she also looks at, I believe it's 3 other Bronzeville schools at different levels that were part of the 2013 school closings that kind of were under like Rahm Emanuel and Barbara Byrd Bennett. So that's kind of the context of this book. It's looking at very specifically at Bronzeville and these kind of Chicago public schools and what was happening to them in this like environment of school where all of these schools were being closed or people were threatening to close them. I guess that's kind of, I think some of them managed to not be, but so what I really appreciate about this book. So I am from like not quite in Chicago. I think people who grow up in Evanston like to think that we're Chicagoans, but we're actually, like, reading this, we're not, because
you're Chicago-ish.
Yeah, see, there we go. Chicago-ish is probably a good a good way to say it. But so I have very little, before I started reading this, I had very little understanding or knowledge of like what was going on with Chicago public schools. And just like, I don't think I understood how big the system is. It's like, it's giant. I mean, Evanston has one high school. Like, that's kind of like, I don't know how to wrap my head around the idea of how the whole Chicago public school system just works. It's so big to me. So that was it. This is kind of like a way for me. It was a way for me to kind of get into that a little bit, because, you know, Eve Ewing focuses on like that specific subset of high school. So it was a great way for me to learn a little bit, but also just broaden my perspective a little bit and understand how much I didn't know. I still don't know. I guess that's a thing.
That's a great thing.
Yeah. I don't know. That's one of the ways that I feel the Chicago suburbs divide in a way that I think as I get older, I see it more and more often, or I feel like I run up against it. And I realize that there is this divide, and people don't talk about it, but it's there. Yeah. And I run up against it in my own like knowledge and kind of the way I think about things. So this book brought that to my attention. And I value it for that. But okay, so shifting gears a little bit into Ewing as a scholar. And I think I have a brain crush on Eve Ewing, because I just think she's so smart and so creative. Okay. So the way that her research was organized and the way that this book is organized, so each chapter presents a different research method that she used to kind of to try and understand this question of why are these schools closing, or why are people trying to close these schools in Bronzeville? And then also, and why is the community, why does the community say, no, don't do this, right? There's this thing of, why are people trying to do this, and why is there the resistance, kind of examining that and trying to understand it. And so she, so first she does some participant observation, which is kind of I want to say it's more of an anthropological technique than a sociologist, but it's all under that like social science research kind of thing. So participant observation, the first chapter, she describes visiting some of the community members who were protesting the closure of Dewitt High School. They went on I think it was like a hunger strike that was just went on. They were very brave and very very committed to do this. I was very much in awe. And you can see that they cared deeply about their community and about this school. But she describes her participant observation with the group who did the hunger strike and worked in that with that group. The second chapter, she spends some time looking at God, there's a word for it, a specific term for it, and I can't remember, but she looks at like the history through the lens of sociology of how Bronzeville came to be the way it is, in terms of history. So looking at specifically she does talk about the Great Migration and then the policies that kept them there, and then kind of follows that, talking about some of the projects and how they, the building, how their the way that they were built affected the schools, and how they continue that kind of that concentration, the forced concentration of people, how that affects schools, 20, 30 years on from that. So there are these like, she's tracing these connections of how schools in Bronzeville are affected by things that happened in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, right? And she's tracing this line of how this is all affecting schools being closed, that are under a threat of closure in 2013, 2014. I thought she did a really great job with it. So that's okay. So that's chapter 2, the second thing. So the third method, she does transcript analysis of open meetings that CPS had about school closures. Okay. So it's just transcript analysis of these. And then the fourth, she does interviews, one-on-one interviews with people who attended or do attend the schools in Bronzeville that were going to be closed in the 2013, the 3 schools that were going to be closed in 2013. So what I value about this is that she uses this range of sources, this range of research methods. And I feel like it just paints such a human picture, because there's her observations, there's history, there's records of kind of institutional records, and then there's individual recollections. And it's just this multifaceted picture of this moment in time, or of this one moment when this issue was, when people were dealing with this issue. And I think it's almost a historical document in terms of like the way that she's laid this out and just painted this picture. But I just like, I think that I never would have thought to structure a research question or the way to go out and answer a research question in this way. And it just strikes me as bold and creative and radical. Okay. And I appreciate her research and the way that she places herself and the humans involved in this topic in her research in that way. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I'm ashamed to say that I haven't read the book. I'm sorry. It's on my shelf. It's somewhere behind me. So I have to get to it at some point. But I am familiar with Dr. Ewing online, and I read 1919. And much like you, I love her online content, her Twitter, Instagram, and those things. so I definitely appreciate her as an educator in that sense. I put it this way: I learned from her online, um, but to hear how she breaks down a book, the way that you just explained it. I mean, you can't do anything but have even more respect for her and how much work she put into this manuscript.
And it's not that big. It's like, this is
Yeah,
a small thing, and you wouldn't know it, but a good chunk of this is her like so like this is like this part of the book, like
mhm.
she does the scholarly thing and like breaks down her methodology and gives you all of her like her coding breakdown and things like this. It's like this is a serious scholarly work, even though
Yeah,
it's like it's short.
yeah. It sounds scholarly and still accessible at the same time.
Absolutely. I saw her interviewed. Well, I've watched a lot of her interviews, and I don't remember where exactly, but someone asked her a question about like kind of how she does that, write so accessibly, and she says, "I write so that my middle school students could understand this," and I'm like, I love
Perfect.
that. That's amazing. Yes,
Perfect.
let's do that.
Right. That's so perfect. Right.
Like
Um,
it makes a lot of sense to me because she's writing that seems to be really the sort, her working with middle school students in
mhm,
CPS, like that seems to be the source of like her, or it seems to be her drive for examining questions like this and her work generally. So it's like
mhm.
bringing it back to them and always centering it on them. Like I'm in awe of that. That's amazing focus and dedication. And yeah.
So now, as an Evanston resident, um, how does the how does the experience of Diet High School compare to your high school experience? I'm assuming you went to Evanston High School.
I did.
So how does what you read about Diet compare to your 4 years at Evanston High School?
Okay. So I actually was thinking about this earlier. So I'm glad you asked this. So I think, and just start off by saying Evanston Township High School is a great school, and I
Mm,
got a great education there.
mm,
Um, I think that some of the things that happen in the large scale across CPS, I think they happen on a smaller scale at Evanston.
okay.
Um, and so I haven't heard, or there, there's never been, I think because it's so much smaller, I don't know that I've heard anything about things like school closing,
Mhm.
in Evanston. I don't think that that has happened. Maybe they've closed one school in my lifetime. I think that's like, that's kind of, that's what I remember.
Mm,
But looking at, tracing some of the ways that Ewing talks about, how inequality in resources showed up in, or so tracing some of the inequality in resources in Chicago
mhm,
public schools, as Ewing does, and using the Bronzeville schools that she examines specifically.
mhm.
Um, you know, I see like within Evanston Township High School, I think I saw like there were actually three different schools there.
Okay.
There was like the honors AP program, there was the regular, and then there was the ESL program, right?
Mhm.
And if you were in one, you very rarely encountered students from the others, right? It
Really?
was like, yeah, I mean, you walked by them in the halls, but you didn't have
That's it.
classes with them, or yeah, it was. So it that's how I see it. It's like there are the kinds of inequalities and things like that, inequalities and separations that you see, I think, more maybe play out geographically
Mhm.
in CPS. I think they do happen. They still happen in the suburbs and in smaller school districts. It looks a little bit different.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. That's what I was thinking. It's like I know that like I never encountered any of the ESL students who were at Evanston Township High School, but I know that they were there. I just
Mhm.
never, so that's kind of where I go with that.
That's interesting. I would have never thought that. um, I mean, people that think about education, there's honors AP, there's regular, and now it's much more common for ESL, but you typically think of those things as you may have one or two AP classes, right? Or, at some point, an AP student and a non-AP student would be in a room together, if not for most of the day, right? You may just have one AP or honors math or whatever. But I never thought about it as like full curriculum tracks.
This might be like a weird North Shore thing too, where it's like, where you have the helicopter parents who like, you have to be in every single AP class you possibly can. Like that also might be a thing. It's definitely, it is a cultural thing that exists. So okay. I acknowledge it. And there, it might be a North Shore thing too.
And I take it you were an AP honor student.
I don't, well, for my sins, yes.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
For my sins, yes. But I mean, that's, I don't know, I think coming back to coming back to a higher education, working in a higher education institution, I think that I see, I don't know, I kind of value, okay. So it's not that I don't value the education that I got there, because I absolutely do. It's that I wish, okay, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. And I don't know what I'm kind of like,
that's okay. That's okay.
I don't want to say anything like that would, okay. This is the part where I'm too nice and I don't want to say anything mean. So I might just stop talking.
No, I understand. Nothing wrong with that.
I don't know. So, but Dewitt, you are a graduate of CPS. Like, I don't know, how did that compare to your experience there? Is there anything in what I kind of shared about Ewing's book like ring true for you? Or I don't know, what do you, in terms of your lived experience, where do you kind of fit with this, or where are you sitting with it?
Well, as a city resident, I've never lived outside of the city, outside of college. I've always lived in the city of Chicago. And I did graduate from a CPS high school. My CPS high school was different, though. It was different than the norm. I went to Whitney Young High School.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Whitney Young is one of the more high-performing schools in the country. And it's classified as a Chicago public school and everything, but the resources are different.
Yeah.
The resources are different. And I mean, Whitney Young is such a high-performing school that even the slackers are like you have to be like a really serious slacker. And I was a full-on slacker. Like that was my person. If slacker had a definition in high school, if they had like you would see like my picture. It's like, oh, this is what we mean by slacker, right? But I was a slacker at a school that constantly wanted the decathlon, that competed nationally academically. So we didn't have the resource issues that Eve Ewing speaks of when she talks about diet and when she talks about the other Bronzeville schools. And the largest systematic things that took place, we knew about them and we heard about them, but it wasn't central to our day-to-day high school experience. So that's my in the building experience. Now, of course, being out of the building, being around the city all the time, my entire family, CPS graduates, you understood the difference, right? You understood that CPS had problems with resources. You understood that there's a clear line, and when it comes to Chicago public schools, high school or elementary, there's a clear line between what I see as the have and the have-nots, right? And it's not necessarily the income level of the family, but someone could name a high school. Like you say, there's before the closing, I think there were there was close to 600 CPS schools total. I think now, because after the closing, and some of them have transformed to charter schools, I think it's somewhere around like 400 maybe. I don't know. But even within such a large number, someone could throw out the name of a school, and you already knew whether or not that school fell on the side of the have or the have-nots. Was then said a lot about the students who were there. Was then said a lot about the futures of the students. It's just understood that this is, if you go to this particular school, this probably is what your future would be, right? Stereotypical. So I was on the have side. When young, it was understood that whether or not it was true, that student is very intelligent, very smart, probably will go to college, right? And then we think about some of the schools that were near Whitney Young on the west side. You have Marshall High School, you had Crane High School. Anyone that's listening, if you went to those schools, I'm pretty sure you're a wonderful person. I'm not trying to down anyone, but those schools, they came with their own sort of perceptions and stereotypes. And everybody knew it was wrong, and you knew something had to be done. But then, and I promise I'll be brief. There's this other side of it that makes me think about what you said about Evanston, right? Evanston High School. You said that how you have the AP, you have the regular students, and you have the ESL, and they're in the building, but they're not with each other much.
Not together.
CPS, because there's so many schools, there's so many people in the city, you have this other underlying culture that a lot of people don't talk about, and that is this fight to get into selective enrollment schools. There's a small amount of selective enrollment schools that you have to test into, and they have the highest academic rigors, and they set you on track for a selective enrollment high school or even to a top college, because we have selective enrollment elementary schools. Yeah,
that's a lot of pressure to put on like a 6-year-old, right? Like, it's a lot of pressure.
Yes, you have to test into these schools in the kindergarten and first grade, right? And they're public school. But what happens is parents want the best for their children.
Yeah.
Many CPS schools are underfunded, lack resources. Then you have the accompanying violence, the inferior education. So now there's this culture underground of people working behind the scenes to get their students into selective enrollment. And sometimes it is not ethical. It is not nice. It is a tooth and nail cutthroat game.
I mean, okay, so I'm familiar with the how cutthroat the selective enrollment can be. I had a couple of friends who went through that, and it was like I was just like, what's going on?
Right.
I don't know. So my thought when you were talking about this was that this seems like it seems like it's a way to kind of amplify the existing inequality. Like you have to work, and you have to be cutthroat to get into these selective enrollment schools. And like, who has the time and the energy to do that? Right. It's like, it feels like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. And it reminded me of, trying to get people signed up for COVID vaccines. And it's like, it almost feels like the same thing. It's like the people who have the time and the energy to actually go through this and try to get an appointment are maybe not the people who need it the most.
Exactly.
I don't know. That's kind of.
No, exactly. And with the selective enrollment thing, it really, what you mentioned, the time and the ability and everything, it really comes down to social capital.
Yeah.
Because
that's the word.
It's a matter of phone calls.
Yeah.
Right. So Hannah and I, we worked at Moraine Valley in 2020, right? So now in 2030, Hannah is the principal of selective enrollment A. Well, guess what? The first thing I'm going to do, even before my child takes the test, I'm going to call Hannah and say, hey, Principal Hannah, I know we're friends. My daughter, she's getting ready to sit for the test. And what's not publicized, and I can go on about this forever, so I got to keep it brief.
Okay.
What's not publicized is that many of these selective enrollment high schools, you have what's called principal exemptions, meaning that the principal has a select number of students who, if they do not pass the entrance test, they can still be admitted. Right. So if I have the social capital to call Hannah, who's the principal, I can say, hey, my daughter didn't pass, but can you let her in? Hannah says, I've known Dewitt since 2020. of course, right? So who tends to have the social capital?
Right.
The people who is usually an income of affluence class thing connected, because these are your friends from college. These are your friends from in other professional realms, right? If you are a single parent with 6 children who didn't graduate high school, you typically don't know the principal of select enrollment A who has a doctorate and, you know, has possibly written books and been this worldwide educator. So that's another layer that many people don't want to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. And gosh, that's, yeah. Okay. So Chicago public schools are complicated, and education on that kind of scale, it can be really, really tricky, just tricky. Yeah. But so Ewing takes a little snapshot, you know, of schools in one community that faced a really hard time. And I just think like the way she looks at it from different perspectives, it's brilliant and creative. And yeah. And so we kind of focused in a little bit on Bronzeville, but your next book is looking at South Shore, right?
Yes, actually a very good book, a book that I really, really enjoyed. It's called The World is Always Coming to an End. And the subtitle is Pulling Together and Apart in the Chicago Neighborhood. And this book is explicitly about the South Shore neighborhood on the southeast side of the city. And not only is it well written and very detailed, but I'm a South Shore resident. I moved to South Shore in 2012. And since then, I've just moved around South Shore. Right now, I'm in my 3rd place in South Shore. So 9 years of being here and living in different parts of it, I know South Shore very well. My mom lived in South Shore before I even moved here. So this book talks about South Shore in very interesting ways. So for those that don't know, as we talked about before, all the Black people who moved to Chicago, they were confined in Bronzeville. So every other neighborhood were predominantly white, including South Shore, which was a predominantly Jewish and Irish neighborhood, all the way up until, I want to say, the 60s or 70s. Fun fact, Larry Ellison, he's the CEO of Oracle, makes Oracle software. He's like worth $1 trillion or whatever. He's born and raised in South Shore. He's a Jewish guy, born and raised in South Shore. But now when you come to South Shore is 100% Black, right? It changed so quickly. And it's some other interesting facts, and I don't want to get too long because I really like it. I can talk forever about it. Some really interesting facts about South Shore. South Shore is in the news a lot for its violence, right? The shootings, just like every other Chicago neighborhood. But South Shore has a very, very affluent community that is right next door to a very, very low income, poor, disadvantaged community. They're literally right in the same pocket, right? So according to this book, South Shore has the highest number of Section 8 residents or government voucher housing, the highest percentage of any neighborhood in the city, right? South Shore also has an above average number of high school dropouts, right? That live in South Shore. But it also has an above average number of PhDs, right? So how do you do that? Right? How do you do that? How do you have an exceptionally high amount of high school dropouts and an exceptionally high amount of PhDs, right? That for everything that we think we know about life, that doesn't exist. So you have these two people there, these families, they're sharing the same schools, they're sharing the same grocery stores, they're sharing the same community centers, right? You have the Highland area, which has homes north of $1 million, but then you have, again, the highest number of Section 8. So it just talks about that and the changes that the neighborhood went through and how the neighborhood is trying to cope with the changes, right? Are these affluent, educated people, do they want to stay? Are they turned off by the violence? Or do they want to leave? Who should stay? Right? There's always the idea of low-income people undereducated people always have a right to be wherever they are, right? And then you have those who say that rather than affluent people leave, they should stay, right? You should have these sort of mixed neighborhoods, right? It shouldn't be a monolithic area. So it talks about that, and then it's a lot of comparison to Inglewood, which Inglewood is the most famous for its violence and its poverty. But there's a strong activist bent to Inglewood, right? There are young people in Inglewood who are working every single day to change it for the positive, and they're making their footprint known in the neighborhood. And Carl Rotella, who's a professor at Boston University, he asked, he grew up in South Shore. He asked, well, how come that same energy isn't being spent in South Shore, right? All of the attention that Inglewood residents are putting on their area, why aren't South Shore residents stepping up to do the same? And there are some, but he talks about that. He juxtaposes the young activists who are trying to do that sort of change, but they're being met with resistance by the older activists. No one wants the affluent to leave because they don't want it to be all low income. But some of those who are affluent say, well, it's in this book, and I can attest to it too. Affluent don't mind staying, but my children won't go to school here, right? And this is not me. I'm putting myself in the affluent. My children won't go to school here. I won't grocery shop here. I won't go anywhere for entertainment here. So everything that I do is to get in the car and leave the neighborhood. Right. Many of the quote unquote affluent people here, they'll drive to Bronzeville to shop at Mariano's, right? Passing 2 grocery stores, which are right here in the neighborhood. The schools, right? The schools are just not great. That's just a fact. The public schools in my neighborhood, they're just not great. So now you're getting in the car every morning to take your kid out of the area. The only thing you're doing in this neighborhood is sleeping, right? So then how much of an impact are you actually having on the area if you are this educated, affluent person who has resources and social capital, who can call a Hannah and say, Hannah, let's put together an organization. You don't do that. You just sleep here and then you get up and then everybody just goes. But absolutely a really good book. I loved it.
Sounds like it. Actually, that kind of reminds me of Evanston a little bit, in terms of, there is that a huge range in the, because you get those, incredible, ridiculous houses along the lake. And then, you also have the part of Evanston that's right along Rogers Park, that's very much like Rogers Park, right? Along the south end of Evanston. And it's all kind of, it reminds me of places where, people who didn't know the area drew the lines. Right. And it can be I feel like getting people to talk to each other is a challenge. I don't know.
It's a very interesting dynamic. When you think about it, it's, and nothing else is like, as I understand it, right? Nothing else is like this sort of neighborhood breakdown for everyone to be so close and yet worlds apart in terms of experiences, right?
Yeah.
But,
Well, what are what would your hopes be? If you do want to stay in South Shore, if you continue, what would some of your hopes be? Or where do you, I don't know.
Well, I think I would like for the two communities to stay together, to live together. Now, I'm not affluent by any means, right? I don't have any money, but I have a
PhD.
I do. So I obviously fall on the higher
I have that.
education spectrum, right? Well, I do have a PhD, and so I am here. I am in that data range of the above average PhD recipients. So I would like for us to blend. And my block is a mixed income block. So we do sort of have that blend. And I would like for each side to understand the other. So there's always this complaint from the affluent South Shore side that the low income side doesn't know how to take care of their properties, right? If they're renting, they have no respect for the property, or even if they're buying, they don't understand what it means to be a homeowner per se. So there's always a complaint from affluent South Shore that you're bringing down property values, you're not cutting your grass, you're not picking up the litter, you're not, you have broken windows, you're not fixing your windows. But then there's always the complaint from the lower income side that says, you always look down at us, you always judge us, you never spend time with us, you don't shop where we shop, you're scared of us. And I would like for some sort of way for those two to, I think it would be beneficial for both. I think it would reduce violence because it is a very violent neighborhood. And I think it would because underlying all of that is you have these differences, but they're all the same race. Everybody's Black, right? Everybody here is Black. So everyone's looking at each other like they're different, but racially they're all the same. So it's a very torn neighborhood, and it really is a block by block neighborhood. On one block, you could have retired firemen, you can have teachers, you can have business owners, and then the next block you have everyone has been incarcerated, right? And then the following block you have, wealthy families, and it's just literally I don't know what to say because you don't have many neighborhoods like that.
No.
So yeah, I would like for everyone to sort of mash the two worlds together. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But
well, I hope, I'm I don't know if you've ever read Adrienne Maree Brown's Emergent Strategy.
I haven't.
Oh, okay. It's she's a lifelong activist. And so it's really in terms of like looking at activist strategy in terms of how you make change. But the thing, like, I read it as a librarian of like, how do you make change in the library in an institution of higher learning? It's like, how do you, wherever you are, how do you make change? And, one of her things is, I think it's like small is good, small is all. And she's like looking at, those like small things that can ripple or magnify. So I guess what I have to add to this is that, even small things can make change over a long term. So I hope that happens and is something that can add to your time there and your experience there, I guess.
We'll see. I guess I'm talking about it. It means I probably should be the one to do it, or I don't want to say the one, because there are a lot of people. Make sure I state this. There are a lot of people in South Shore doing a lot of really good work to make those things happen. I'm not one of them at the moment, so maybe I should join the people who are working to make that happen.
There is always more to do wherever we are.
Yeah,
always.
Very true.
Oh, well, I think we've gone over an hour this time, so we probably should wrap up.
We've gotten wrapped up in our books.
Here we go.
I'm so surprised.
But books that taught us a little bit about Chicago. I hope that you, whoever you are watching, maybe will enjoy some of them too, or are inspired to go out and find other books to help you understand the great, vast, diverse, numerous, populous, surprisingly historical place that Chicago is.
Yes.
Okay, then I guess we'll sign off. Unless, Dewitt, do you want to say anything else?
Nope. Thank you very much, Hannah, for being a great book colleague. I'm enjoying the conversation.
Me too. Okay, well, we'll see you next time then.